Hello everyone, welcome to the Wight webinar in how to effectively execute short-term plans in the healthcare industry. This is planned to be the first in a series of webinars where we're focusing particularly on planning in healthcare. And today we're going to look at particularly the short-term or tactical planning horizon. So some of the short-term planning challenges that we face, and specifically in the healthcare sector. So welcome, my name's Steve Rowntree, and I'm joined today by Gary Connors, both partners in Oliver Wight. And we both come from a background in pharma, medical devices, and the healthcare sector in general. As we go through today, we're scheduled for 1 hour, so we'll take you through some of the challenges within short-term planning in that hour. And if you have any questions, please use the question box. We'll pick up the questions, and if we get time towards the end, we'll ask those questions. If we see some come through during the webinar, of course, we'll try and answer those as well as we go. If you do have any difficulties on the webinar, then again use the question box, and the facilitator will try and help any technical problems you're having. And the webinar will be available for download from our website, so we'll be loading the webinar up onto our website. So in terms of topics, we wanted to focus and for healthcare. So this is one of the first webinars we've done for a healthcare specific, a sector specific, and we chose healthcare because we have clients within that sector. So we want to look through today a little bit of the introduction of where some of the best practice come from, and some of the background to how we got here with this webinar. And then we'll just look at the linkages to IBP, Integrated Business, because it's important we have both a long-term planning process to secure a short-term execution process. So we'll talk through briefly some of the linkages to IBP, and then for the rest of the webinar, we're looking at some of the short-term planning challenges and looking at some of the key elements for success. Again, because of the first of a series, we're going to look at some of the fundamentals that are required for success in short-term planning processes. We've got a few polls we'll do throughout the hour, and just ask you to, when we go to polling, if you just give us a response on the polling, we'll see the response, and it'll help us to frame the future webinars as well that can help you going forward. We'll look at measures and some of the key measures, and then towards the end we'll be able to look at some of the questions and some answers. Hopefully some of those questions are out there. So if you look at the background, so if you look at some of the background, how we got here. So Oliver Wight as an organisation have been around for a good number of years and developed some of the thought leadership in planning. And Oliver Wight himself, when he started out in the 1960s, 70s, was asked to develop a checklist for what good looked like. So he developed a checklist of some 20 questions that said to industry leaders, if you're doing things right, then you will have some of the best practices there in industry. Remember, that was like late 70s, so some of those questions are fairly fundamental. We're now, over the years we've worked through, we're now in our 7th edition of that checklist, which is now the 7th edition standard for excellence, and we released that this year and is available as the benchmark for business excellence. So a lot of what we talk about has been tried and tested over the years, and obviously it's developed where we are today as best practice for industry. And with healthcare, that brings some uniqueness around how we have to look at some of those challenges, and we want to spend a little bit of time as we go through this hour just looking at some specific challenges we see within the healthcare sector. So next slide, please. So the challenge for most businesses, and again, it's not unique to healthcare, but we see it in the clients that we have within the sector, is not only do they have to manage long term, integrated business planning provides that framework, but they also have to effectively manage the short term, and that's really related to some of the tactical planning decisions that have to be taken to manage that short term. So we see within the sector that while some businesses have a very strong integrated business planning process and have some good, strong decision making in the long term, the short term sometimes undermines that in its ability to be effective in managing short term changes. And in addition, this won't be a surprise to people in the sector, the healthcare sector has some uniqueness around it. For example, the regulatory environment that the business works in provides some uniqueness that other sectors don't see. Obviously, a high level of customer service is critical, and with some of the products that the industry supplies, that is an option that has to be there. And then we do see some short-term challenges in the planning process around external factors like tender business, which, if not planned or factored in, can make the disruption in the ability to execute the schedule. So we'll talk through some of those processes as we go through the hour. What we typically see is the challenge of integrating quality and the quality functions. Probably not unique in quality. There are supporting functions that need to be integrated too. But we do see a challenge often around how that is built in, that those processes are built into our short-term planning. So we'll pick up on some of those things as we go through. And one of the things we did recently from a healthcare perspective, we held a conference in May, which was well attended. And again, it was one of our first industry sector conferences that we've held. That was really looking at what were the challenges, both in long-term planning and short-term planning. And we got some good feedback around some of the positive aspects of how to address those challenges and some of the sector challenges that people were relating. So we did poll delegates on top opportunities, and we would like to take the opportunity today to do the same with people online, to chance to look at what's your top opportunity that you see currently in the healthcare sector. So we've got 5 areas that we typically see as being challenges. So first one is the ability to have realistic plans that are based on demonstrated performance. We often see that as a major challenge. Responding to short-term requests, that could be that there's been additional sales or uptake in the market, or it could be tenders that we're having to respond to. Defining clear roles and responsibilities, the supply planning functions and what they are, what those roles and responsibilities are. Accuracy, data management, which is another key area that we see sometimes as being a challenge, and especially when some of that is integrated into quality systems, how that is maintained and managed. And then defining a clear set of measures that can help to drive improvement. So those are the 4 areas. So I'd like to ask you to give your top opportunity, so score one of those, and we'll take that feedback from you of which ones you see major challenge or opportunity. Okay, so thank you for that feedback. And as you can see from the polling we did there, that the realistic plans based on demonstrated performance are scoring fairly definitely high in the opportunity. And then a kind of equal mix around some of the other ones around short-term requests, data accuracy, and the measures. So it's interesting to see that that is one of the key challenges, because it's typically something that we see as something we have to focus on with businesses to help them to improve that process. So we'll show you what we had feedback when we did this in the conference we held in May, and you can see not dissimilar that one of the key things was demonstrate capacity and realistic plans. So that's a good confirmation for us. So that's an area that people are seeing as a challenge. And then the other one that did come through quite strongly when we did the conference was the set of metrics to business excellence targets was seen as another challenge. So it's a good confirmation for us of where some of that challenge is in the sector.
A lot of similarities, and the rest of what we'll talk about today will underline at least the first one, realistic plans based on demonstrated capacity. So that's good to see. When we look at this slide, these are the type of challenges that we see from all of our clients, no matter what industry we go to. But there are some specific ones here that we see coming up again and again with healthcare clients. And the first one being healthcare being a very regulated industry. How do we overcome the challenges of being regulated with the ambitions of wanting to be agile? So that would be a first thing to consider. Some of the other signposts that resonate very strongly with our healthcare clients would be getting closer to the customer. Whatever sector in healthcare there's always a desire to recognize that there's a patient at the end of the supply chain, a person using the product that we're making, and desire to get it right. So focus on the customer would be key. Asset utilization, cost cutting, and reduced stock are perennial within most sectors we work in, but every healthcare client we have at some point in time has either a cost reduction or a inventory reduction or an asset utilization initiative going on. And it's important to understand how we integrate those initiatives into the long-term planning process for the business and how we overcome them in the short-term tactical planning. If we have a look at the next slide, Zoe, we look at our integrated business model, which is described in the 7th edition of the Oliver Wight checklist that we spoke about earlier. And within this model here, we would see typically everything that's required from a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month, and year-to-year set of processes in order to deliver the strategy. Those processes could be bucketed into a set of processes that are shaping the portfolio, a set of processes that are determining our commercial demand, a set of processes that are determining our response to that demand within the supply chain, and culminating in a management business review being the ultimate authority and decision-making forum for making the key business decisions by the leadership team each month. So we've drawn a line across this model to differentiate the above-the-line activity, which is the monthly cycle aggregate level activity, and the below-the-line being the detailed project management, sales execution detail, supplier management, supply point management, So above the line, aggregate level, monthly buckets, below the line, detailed weekly and daily activity. So the rest of this discussion today is going to be focused on doing a deeper dive into the supply leg of the model, having a look at some of the requirements of below the line processes in the model. So if we click onto the next slide, we can reveal the processes that are above the model, we call integrated business planning. And we've spoken through those on the previous slide at a very high level, whereas those are important and will help deliver the strategy and are critical business success. Without the detail below the line processes, the ambition of the organization won't be fully realized. So we're going to spend the rest of today dipping below the line and not talking about these important business planning processes in any more detail.
I think whilst we're going to focus on supply elements, obviously specifically in healthcare, product management, R&D linkages, new pipeline, portfolio management is critical. That view of demand and getting that long-term, medium-term, and short-term view of demand to be able to respond to it. So both of those areas we would hope to cover sometime in future webinars. As Gary said, the supply review, the supply area is where we want to do a bit of deep dive.
That came through as a critical area from the event that we held in April. But equally important are, of course, detailed processes in the other below the line area. So if we click on to going down now into the supply review and below the line processes in supply, if we click on the next slide, there's a couple of key things that we want to get across in order to frame where we are and what we're talking about. So on this slide on the left-hand side, you would see this is where we're at today, looking out into the future, and right up to the right-hand side of this graph, which would show you the full horizon of the integrated business planning process. Along that continuum somewhere, we need to establish a time fence that we call the planning time fence. Outside of the planning time fence would be a zone that we would call the supply planning zone, where we are required and we're happy to plan at an aggregate level, rough cut capacity planning, and to review that plan in monthly bucket. But once we come inside that time fence, we have a real need to dive down into the detail. We're now talking about perhaps SKU level detail. We're talking about perhaps weekly buckets rather than monthly. And at times we have less ability to be agile. There's much more discussion, agreement and trading that goes on for controlling changes inside that time fence. And once we get into the final zone, this is where change would become very difficult. We may have already started the run on the packaging line. We may have already started the manufacturing of the bulk tablets. So we would want to avoid changes in this final zone without the detailed control processes that need to be in place to drive stability in these two zones. So agile outside the time fence, and as we approach today, we come more and more focused on stability and execution. So those are the messages from this slide. And if we click on one more, we would go to the key elements supporting integrated tactical planning.
Yeah. Okay.
So this is what we're going to go through for the rest of today.
So we looked at, in order to manage that short-term plan, so we're typically, as Gary said, looking at days and weeks, and we're typically looking at SKU or stock keeping units or item levels. So it's a level of detail. In order to achieve that, we need to have some criteria in place, in place. And we looked at what would be the key supporting elements that we'd have to have established in order to gain control and be successful to achieve that execution of the plan in the short term. So we'll talk through each one of these in turn and give you some of the pointers that we think are critical from a business perspective to understand. We'll start off with the supply model itself, and then we'll do. Sorry, could you go back? Sorry, just go back one slide. And then we'll talk about the inventory management aspects. And obviously, these are always integrated and tied together to be successful. We want to spend a little bit more time on capacity planning because we recognize that both capacity planning and execution schedule are really where the core of the and being successful, happy. And then we'll look towards the end just a little bit on data management and what are the critical data sets that we should consider. And then performance measures that will help to ensure that we're successful in achieving that business excellence level of performance. So if we take the supply model first. So clearly, one of the things that we need to understand in developing the supply model, and this really sets the scene for how we're going to manage our supply plan and be successful at meeting customer expectations. But in doing that, we need to make sure that's fully aligned to the supply chain strategy, which in turn needs to be aligned to the business strategy. So we do have to have input from executive level leaders in the business in setting out the game plan for being successful at developing our supply response. And that does need to be aligned to strategy. So we need to understand the key elements of the business that need to be responsive in, how we're going to be responsive, how we're going to prioritize our response to the market, etc. So that's an input to the process. The rest of the model needs to align to that strategy. And again, without that, it's very hard to then execute the strategy effectively. Some of the other things to think about is where you meet the customer. So when we're looking at the customer and our responsiveness to the customer, clearly in pharma and healthcare, medical devices, a lot of the time we would meet the customer with finished product, but understanding where that actually, where the customer sits and how we respond to that is critical. So we're doing to make sure that we've got a very clear understanding of our offering to the customer and what level of customer service performance we are planning to achieve to be successful in the market. And I suppose maybe not surprisingly, because you guys will be feeling this as well, over the last 2 years, some of the feedback from customers is their number one criteria from pharma and healthcare is product availability. So if you look at some of the feedback from customers, product availability would be one of the things they'd cite as a key differentiator for their choice of supplier. So again, understanding that and what it takes to achieve that is critical. We need to think also about planning parameters that support the business. So this is the plan we will put in our system, our ERP system, to allow us to execute the plan effectively. And again, we need to make sure that data is managed and correct, and we have a good understanding of that. I'd say out of the ones we've listed there, the cycle time, lead time is probably one of the ones that people don't manage as effectively as they should. So when we start working with businesses, sometimes we will talk about lead times and cycle times, and actually what they're actually achieving is different from what they have in the system. That does cause a problem when you start to use a system to support your planning execution processes. So these are areas that in the first instance we want to make sure are correct and accurate, reflective of how the business is performing, and then ultimately we need to look at how we drive improvements in those going forward. Agility, flexibility. So we define agility as the ability to change the product you're manufacturing. So your ability to supply a different product, which is different to flexibility, which would be the ability to make more of the product you're making or less of the product you're making. So we need to understand where we need to build in that agility in our supply model, and the cost of that agility and the cost of that flexibility. And again, having those discussions up front in defining the model allows us to provide a good basis and the planning and scheduling community to execute that. And then lastly, on the supply model, again, it's another element that we need to be very clear about is where the key accountabilities sit in managing and executing the process. Roles and responsibilities. So if we think about planners, supply chain planners, material planners, etc., what are those roles and responsibilities, and how do they sit within the organisation, and what are their remits that they work within? And a lot of this is about giving the planners and schedulers and managers in the business the tools to be able to execute the schedule, plan and execute the schedule effectively. So that's some of the key elements to consider.
And please read alongside these bullet points the importance of discipline and in sticking to the model. In many of our healthcare clients that we work with, we would see a small group of planning experts or a planning center of excellence that would have a clear understanding of all of the requirements of these bullet points, but those are either not communicated and well understood by the rest of the business, or they're understood by the rest of the business, but the behavior and the discipline is not there to stick to the parameters and rules that have been agreed in the model. So if we move on to the next slide, we're going to dip into inventory. And a couple of points to bear in mind in managing inventory is that rule number one, we need to understand exactly what we've got and where we've got it. And in order to do that, we need to have a robust process of managing the accuracy of the quantity and location and quality of inventory right across the network. This means not just in the warehouse, but right through the distribution network, what we have line side waiting to be packed, what we have packed waiting to be approved. All of that needs to be robustly managed.
I think often one that gets omitted is WIP rather than yeah. So that's sometimes one that gets less focused than it probably should.
Often we look at an inventory accuracy metric in an organization and find that the scope of what is being measured does not include what is in work in progress or line side waiting to be packed, and that's where the problems arrive. We need to be looking at and understanding the footprint and distribution network and supplier relationships that we've designed into the model. Bearing that in mind, so where should we be carrying the inventory within our distribution network or within our footprint according to the model that we've designed? And where are we carrying inventory in reality, where we see deviations from what is being, where we're carrying inventory and where we should be carrying inventory, where we're seeing planned decoupling points where we're expecting to carry inventory and yet that inventory is missing and it's being carried in other places, covering up other problems, buffering variability elsewhere in the supply chain. All of that needs to be understood and robustly managed. And when we've got on top of all of that, we've got inventory in the right place, we're measuring it, and we need to then have a culture of driving improvement. So understanding our lead times, trying to reduce lead times, removing waste, all needs to drive towards becoming more agile and removing inventory that's covering up the problems that we have in our supply chain. So if we move on to the next slide, there's a discussion around capacity management.
So as you highlighted in the first poll, this is an area that often is problematic for lots of businesses, and it's really around understanding what the true capacity is that we are planning and executing against. I think one of the challenges we often see, and definitely if you look at kind of manufacturing operations, I think the default is almost eternally optimistic in what our capability is. So it's almost that attitude of, well, it'll be all right, we'll work it through, we'll make it happen, which doesn't do us any favors if we're trying to execute a plan that is over the stated capacity. So having a discussion up front around what the demonstrated capability is important. And that's equally important, as Gary said when we talked about the IBP process, business planning. It's important from a rough cut perspective. It could be equipment, it could be physical resources that we're talking about, individual skills and people and the capability need to execute the schedule. So if we've got vacation or we've got sickness levels we need to factor in because something's changing, then we need to build that into our short-term capacity planning process. So that discussion up front is critical, and I often find that there's a discussion needed with leadership in this as well, in that sometimes what we're communicating is not always palatable in the organization, but the question really is, if that's our demonstrated capability and we need more, what are we going to do to enable us to provide more? And that's more the question we need to have discussion around, rather than just increasing the capacity plan that is non-achievable. In addition to that, some of the key things is understanding our flex capacity. So we often refer to as maximum capacity, but that's really saying this is not theoretical. This is a capacity that we can achieve and we can make happen relatively easily. So if it were overtime or additional shifts or using a different line, then that would be something we build into our capacity plan to say what's our flex capability if we have to use that. Typically, this is used for a relatively short-term period of time, although we may plan to step change the capacity in the long term. Flex capability gives us ability to be flexible where we need it. And one of the key elements in being successful in managing a demonstrated capacity is understanding your load factors. So this is really the efficiency factor that reflects our current performance or recent performance. So it's built on the capacity or the achievement of the plan over the last few weeks and months, and then translates that into what's our current performance that we plan going forward. So there's some key aspects we need to consider there around what our demonstrated capacity is, what our planned demonstrated capacity is going forward, which may include improvements, and that's legitimate in the discussions that we have in our capacity review process. But we're looking for a commitment to achieving those improvements and tracking those improvements as we go forward. So a reiteration that we're actually on track to deliver those. One of the things that we often see is a lack of accountability for the commitment against the capacity. So we see other people in the business making commitments against resource capability that don't have that accountability of the actual resource. So one of the early discussions is who is actually accountable for the resource that we are managing, and that's critical when we get to that detail level, because our plans should be against that committed resource that we have agreed. And remember, So people often go straight to manufacturing when we talk about capacity, but we are talking about any critical resource. So that could be quality, could be engineering, could be R&D, it could be manufacturing, it could be warehouse space, it could be logistics, could be planning. Looking at all those resources being managed through a capacity planning process. The one that often gets forgotten is quality as a function in terms of capacity planning. And again, that often leads to a problem within healthcare because we haven't considered the impact on the quality of our plans and execution. The last bit really is around improvements. So if we have agreed our capacity, then we do need to understand how we can improve that going forward and get the commitment to the action plans that are going to deliver that improvement in our capacity. So this is kind of the other part of the equation when we talk about capacity. If we need to improve or drive efficiency, how are we going to do that? What's the action plan? And when can we commit that from a resource perspective into the capacity plan itself? So a key area, as you highlighted, where often the business doesn't give enough focus early on and a reluctance to accept some of the performance that we are achieving. So an area that we probably need to re-establish the baseline very quickly and build up plans against that baseline so that we get a true demonstrated plan going forward.
And this is an area that we see many times as almost endemic in the healthcare industry, much more so than some other faster moving supply chains where the senior leaders in the supply chain organization were yesterday's supply point managers and management level. They remember the rate that the resources used to run at when they were at that level, and they still have a behavior to push that understanding down in the organization to drive the assets to a level that is no longer realistic, or perhaps was never really achieved in the first place, except on a really good day when everything went perfectly. So we need to get that behavior out of the organization.
And I've seen that same discussion with the different, so the product mix has changed. Yeah. But the old numbers are what people commit to rather than the new numbers. Because like 5 years ago we had a different product mix.
And if you get the senior management pushing down unrealistic targets, the supply plans and schedules no longer become the accountability of the people that are currently executing because they've been given targets that are not achievable. So rough capacity planning is fundamental and the use of demonstrated capacity to gaining control of the supply plan outside the time fence. When it comes inside the time fence, we need a more deep, more frequent capacity management process in order to gain control of those short-term schedules. So if we flick on to the next slide, we want to talk about realistic plans and realistic execution. So the schedules that will have been created inside this planning time frame will be based on the demonstrated capacity, demonstrated supply plans that we will have created outside of the time frame. What we need to do now is have a really clear understanding of who's responsible and who's accountable, who's consulted and who's informed for the management of these schedules and execution of the schedule. So what is the role of the supply planner? What is the role of the supply scheduler? What is the role and the relationship between the scheduler and the operations folks that are executing the schedule? And how do they work together in synchronicity with each other in order to ensure that everybody's clear what their roles are and we're executing the schedule to the best of our ability, and that everybody is involved. So oftentimes we would see in healthcare organizations where schedules are created for warehousing, what is required to be shipped today, what is going to be expected to be received, what needs to be sent to the plant, coming back from the plant. Schedules would be created for bulk operations and for packaging operations. Schedules would be created for ship operations and distribution operations. But oftentimes, the quality operation would sit outside of the scope of the scheduling activity. And the driver behind that often is that we don't want to compromise the quality of the product by putting pressure on the quality organization. And what we see time and time again, that if we fully integrate the quality organization into the discipline and rigor of the scheduling processes, it provides them with the stability and control, lack of firefighting in the headspace to make better quality decisions. So integrated quality produces the output we desire rather than excluding them for the best of intentions. So we want to have this, all stakeholders are involved in what we schedule in an organization. We want to create realistic schedules. We're taking into account all of the activity that calls on capacity of the assets, where we have maintenance that's been taken into account, where we have labor constraints that has been taken into account, where we have risks associated with the assets that have been taken into account. And we have a weekly process that's looking at the schedules we've created against the demonstrated capacity of that asset on a weekly basis. And we're making decisions within this period to level load or to flex in order to make sure we stay on schedule. We're communicating up and down the supply chain in order to work together for a common goal of achieving the execution of the schedule. We're measuring everything from a schedule adherence, a schedule stability. We're measuring supply plan achievement, and we'll come on to metrics in a little while in more detail. But measure root cause, identify where the issues are, correct the action, the root causes, and work together as a team for the execution of the schedule would be the theme that we try to pass on to the healthcare industry.
So I would see, just to reiterate what Gary said, that I would see quality, maintenance, calibration, environmental monitoring as being some of the things that get left out of the schedule discussion on that week-to-week basis, and therefore aren't part of the commitment to executing the schedule. So dialing those functions in is probably critical to having good execution that people all sign up to. So often manufacturing are there at the table and take the lead, but it's those other functions that probably make or break whether the business is successful routinely of hitting the execution measures.
Yeah, and we'll talk about measures in a little while, but if we've got a master schedule performance metric and it doesn't include the quality step, we're just building inventory, not creating stability, and it is often what we see in healthcare, but it's something we strongly advise against.
I see that culturally, whilst healthcare quality always seen as a obviously priority and integral to the business, I'd see often that in the early days of trying to develop processes, there's still that hand it over from manufacturing to quality rather than joint ownership. Surprising sometimes how things like right first time are not key measures, even though you'd expect them to be. So building that relationship and breaking down some of the silos that may exist is probably critical to being able to develop your realistic plans and reliable execution.
Okay, so on the next slide, having said all of that so far, can we take a poll at this point in the hour we have together to try and get an understanding of what your critical issues are? Are they understanding your demonstrated capacity and your demonstrated performance? Or number two, if defining your flex capacity is something you're wrestling with, and flex capacity, as Steve said earlier, may be your ability to sprint in the short term, perhaps put on overtime, perhaps work weekend on an extra shift temporarily. Your flex capacity is that your executing your schedules effectively. Number three, if that is your critical issue, or is it short-term events that are impacting the schedule, unplanned events that are driving you off schedule constantly?
And they could be external or internal. So you could have external demand changes that are driving some of that, or you could have process issues that are driving some of that.
Yeah. Or are you in control of all of that? And really, the process of driving improvements is what you need to be focusing on right now. So if we give you a minute to select 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. Okay, so quite interesting result. Short-term events are impacting the schedule, and of course that can be very frustrating. So we've created what we believe is a good schedule, and yet when we try to execute these schedules, we are firefighting and dealing with short-term issues that are in. There's two categories of short-term events impacting the schedule that we often see, and both of them become something we need to account for in the schedule. One of them may be what we call common cause events. They always happen. We don't plan for them, and yet they happen over and over again. These are things we should be taking into account when we work out our demonstrated capacity. We should be planning for those types of short-term events. The second category would be special cause events, and these would be things that are not repeatable and are not plannable. And what we should be doing to account for those events is not loading the asset to the full demonstrated capacity, because we know something is going to happen in the short term, we just don't know when. So we need to plan within the schedule, the headspace to respond to those types of events. So interesting. If we move on to data, what is this? Yes. Data.
Thank you for that feedback. So the other two areas that we just want to touch on this afternoon, and we'll take some questions, was data management and performance measures. So really the foundation of us being able to make good decisions is to have good data. And I suppose one of the challenges in health is that people would front that because we are quality driven by business needs, because we're quality driven, the data must be good. It must be good quality because we have processes that maintain that level of data quality. And whilst that is true from a quality perspective, it's not always true from a planning perspective. So we do need to make sure that the data that underpins our processes from a planning perspective is being managed. And often the challenge is that this doesn't necessarily directly affect the quality of the product we're making, but it almost certainly affects the quality of our ability to plan. So first of all, make sure we've got good data governance of how we manage data in terms of new data coming in, obsolete data, and the management of data as it changes, and who does what, how that's structured, and who has the accountability and responsibilities for updating data. Often different, so the accountability is not always the same as the person might be responsible for updating. But we need to make sure that is very explicit in the business, and invariably quality will be part of that process. So if you look at some of the data sets that do directly have an impact on the product, then you'd expect the quality process to maintain some of that data, but typically not all. We do need to make sure that we've got measures in place that measure the accuracy of the data. And there's not a shortcut to this, in that if we don't measure it, then we don't have a good way of demonstrating that the data is in control. It's important, even though that might be something that is extra, seen or perceived as extra work, it's important that we have a process that actually shows what the performance of our data accuracy is, and that is reported and shared to the organization. And for me, this is all about building confidence in the foundations of our processes. But people shouldn't really routinely have to question any of the data accuracy, because we should have processes that are maintaining that data to make sure it's accurate. And that allows then that data to be used for information, which then allows us to make good quality decisions, whether that's short-term, medium-term, or long-term. Data integrity, I suppose the challenge we often see is sometimes system capability of how quickly we can update data. And almost certainly in healthcare, because if it's quality related data, it has to go through a number of steps to be updated. The timeliness of, or the ability to do that in a timely fashion, can sometimes be a problem. So a good example of that is bill of materials, which may go through the quality system, may require a number of approvals before that can be updated in the system, and therefore may take time. If that's not fit for purpose, then we have a problem. So we need to make sure that we've got a good understanding of how often the data needs to be updated. Types of data, so you can see from the chart there that we've got on the screen, it's all the data that supports our planning processes. So we see routines, the planning parameters, inventory, etc., are all critical data sets that do need to be managed for us to be able to have a good process that we can rely on. And it's the ability to use the systems and the ERP system effectively that is usually undermined if we don't trust the data. I'd say number one reason for people not using the ERP system and going outside the system, if you really ask the question, it will come down to we don't trust the data. So something we do need to put effort into initially, and it becomes one of the warning systems, or if we have a problem going forward from a critical business perspective.
And also relating this back to the previous poll where we said short-term issues affecting the schedule. In our experience over the years, inaccurate data is the number one root cause of those types of issues that are affecting the short-term schedule. And it's a particular blind spot in the healthcare industry because we are so regulated. The drive for the paradigm is to be compliant with our registered parameters. So if we have registered bills of materials ranges and runtimes and routings, if any of that data is registered, the paradigm becomes we need to comply with that data, which of course is critically important to product quality. But from a point of view of maintaining valid shipments and executing realistic and reliably, we need to operate within a much smaller bandwidth than the registered and regulatory tolerances that we have. So that becomes a particular challenge for the healthcare industry. Operating under the belief that our data is in control because we don't wander outside of our registered ranges, and yet in terms of requirements to execute a reliable schedule, we need to be much tighter than that. So we're talking about measurement. If we move on to the next slide, to the promised discussion on performance measures. This could become a topic for an entire webinar in the future. But critical metrics that we would see in terms of schedule execution would be number one, master schedule performance. So we create a master schedule for our high-level, end-level items, and are we hitting the available to ship data, including quality? Are we all together collectively managing the execution of the schedule so we can hit that date on time, in full, to the day? We then have a manufacturing schedule set of metrics that would be looking at our ability to execute each manufacturing operation on time. And in order to make that happen, a schedule stability metric that is managing change within those emergency and trading zones, and a whole suite of data management metrics that Steve was talking about on the previous slide that is bringing control to the organization. So that is what we're looking for.
I just add, I think on these ones, initially these might be seen as lagging measures because you're trying to drive improvement in these. Once you're in control, they do become leading measures because these give you no indication of something changing. For example, schedule stability. If that starts to drop, then you know that something is changing, which may or may not be causing a problem in the future. So it's critical that these are measured as suite of measures, and this is only a sample of some of the measures we expect to see in the process. So, we just want to do a last poll with you before we finish today. And really this is looking at some of the, what would you like us to look at next when we look at this tactical planning process, webinar perspective. So just to get some input, we thought data management in healthcare might be something to focus in on, a bit more detail. Demand execution, including tenders. We didn't cover any of this today, but tenders can often be a disruptor to your plans and your schedules. So whilst they're good and important from a business perspective and growing the business, it can be problematic from a supplier perspective, not planned. IBP linkages to and from integrated tactical planning. Supply chain roles and responsibilities. We've touched a little as we've gone through today on roles and responsibilities, so maybe that needs a little more explanation. And then, as Gary said, we spend a whole webinar on performance management and driving improvement. So we'd just like to poll on which you would be keen to, for us to focus on in this series of tactical planning webinars that we have planned. And whilst you're doing that, if you do have any questions or additional questions, please feel free to ask those quickly. Okay, so we've got a few there as expected. So we've got performance measures. I think that would be a very important one for us to tackle and to work through and describe, and we can widen that out a little bit into some of the supporting measures that we've put in place. And then demand execution. So as Gary said at the beginning, we focus very much on the supply leg of the short-term planning processes. But demand execution, we know, can be problematic if we don't get that right. And then data management was the third one. So that's very good inputs, and we'll build that into our future seminars. So the questions have come in today. We've got a couple here that we will just touch on briefly. So one of them is how important is it to, tying to the topics you raised, how important is it to get a clear demand signal? So just a quick answer to that, and maybe this is something we pick up on one of our next webinar. I think from a supply perspective, it's important to understand the quality of demand signal coming in from from the commercial side of the business. So we need to know how good that is. And we need to understand if there is any bias in that measure. So they're two key things to understand. Even though the supply leg doesn't have, or the supply part of the business doesn't have responsibility for that. And also, I think the other thing is to make sure that we've got a holistic view of the demand plan. So we need to make sure it's included.
The only build on that, Steve, I think would be to understand the difference between dependent demand and independent demand. So independent demand is the one that changes when the customers change their mind or want something different. The dependent demand is something that should be consistent within the organization. It's a set of net requirements that get passed back through the organization. And if that's not in control, it's entirely within our gift and within the organization to understand the root cause of that and to.
I think it's very, very critical. And we've got a few other questions that we won't get time to actually cover today, so we'll make sure we cover those in future webinars. One's around the design of the planning team and the organisational structure. We'll try and tackle that in a future webinar. And another question on data and some of the data challenges, data sets. So whilst we've run out of time today, we'll make sure we pick those up in future webinars. Just before we close today, just a couple of things that of interest. If you aren't already, please join our Forum for Healthcare Leaders. That's available through LinkedIn search. So please make sure you're part of that forum, because we welcome you and your input into our discussions in that forum. We're posting discussion documents frequently on that forum. And lastly, I just want to mention as well, because it's the first time we've really targeted this to healthcare. We are planning a public workshop in Ireland in November, the end of this year, so enough notice out there, which is focused on delivering supply chain planning in the healthcare sector. So uniquely for us, we're going to target a particular sector, so it's not broad, it's specific to the healthcare sector, and we welcome you to join us there on that public workshop if you have availability. So I hope it's been useful for you today for the webinar, and again, thank you for myself and Gary for joining us today. We're going to continue the webinars going forward, and hope you can join us next time round as we take on board some of your feedback as well. Thank you.